And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Now, continuing our discussion on the Israeli-Palestinian situation, what I'm going to be doing for you in this last section of the show is I'm going to be reading quotes to you from a book called BDS. It's the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Handbook, a global campaign to end Israeli apartheid. And I'm going to be paraphrasing a lot of the things out of this book and reading passages from it and talking to you myself amongst the passages. And so I just want to clear that up for you now. And the first thing that I want to start with, there was an article by Sonia Karka of Electronic Intifada dated May 2007 called John Howard's Dubious National Fund Honour. And that article refers to the Jewish National Fund, or JNF. And in that article, Ms. Karka says, the Jewish National Fund is one of the most prominent Zionist colonization enterprises. It illegally expropriated most of the land of 372 Palestinian villages which were ethnically cleansed by Zionist forces in 1948. The owners of this land constitute over one half of the UN-registered Palestinian refugees. In many instances, the JNF actively participated in the physical destruction of the villages, evacuating their inhabitants and planting parks in their place. Today, the JNF controls 2,500 square kilometres of Palestinian land, which it leases to Jews only. Its aim is to acquire and develop land exclusively for the benefit of Jews residing in Israel. For the last decade, it has marketed itself as the premier Zionist environmental organisation, promoting its blueprint Negev as a miracle of the desert. Thousands of indigenous Bedouin Arabs have been subjected to systematic land confiscations, the destruction of their homes, and deprived of access to flowing water. Some 80,000 Bedouins who once owned 90% of the land in the Negev have been living in 45 unrecognised villages in Israel with no access to amenities and basic services denied to them. The JNF is a multinational corporation with offices in about a dozen countries worldwide, where it is generally registered as a charity. It receives millions of dollars from wealthy and ordinary Jews around the world, most of which are tax-exempt contributions. To avoid investigation, honours are bestowed upon non-Jewish notables, such as naming forests after them, and some of Australia's former Prime Ministers are among them. JNF also extends its operations by proxy or directly into the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza, and all this is in clear violation of international law, and particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention, which forbids confiscation of property and settling of the occupier's citizens in occupied territories. Ethnic cleansing, expropriation of property and destruction of homes are war crimes. As well, use of tax-exempt donations in these activities violates the domestic law in many countries where the JNF is domiciled. And that really is a very rational summary of the Jewish National Fund by Sonia Karka, folks. See, the root of the problem is that when Israel was unilaterally created in May 1948, less than 6 months after the UN voted to petition Palestine, what happened was it dispossessed the Palestinian people of their homes, properties and lands, and refused more than 750,000 of them the right to return home. And those Palestinians from that period and their descendants are still either internally displaced or are living in refugee camps in neighbouring countries. They now number around 5 million, I believe. Now, in 1967, Israel occupied the remaining Palestinian lands, the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza Strip, and to this day has subjected the Palestinians living there to a brutal regime of apartheid and ethnic cleansing as it continues to execute with impunity its colonization program and the Judaization of the Palestinian lands. Now, at the time of Israel's 1967 conquest, one of its most revered intellectuals, a man called Yeshayahu Leibowitz, prophesied that this colonizing situation will turn into a system of imposed rule over two peoples, one ruling and the other ruled. and he then surmised it to be unlikely that human rights and civil freedoms could exist even within the Jewish sector. The consequences, he said, will lead to the self-destruction of the Jewish state and of relations with the Arabs based on perpetual terror. And he warned Israel that there was no way out of this situation except by withdrawal from the territories. And now, more than 4 decades later, in 2012, the warning bells may well be ringing too late for Israel, and it could be seen to be exemplified by the latest conflict in Gaza that Israel is now imploding and that justice is waiting at the gates. Now, I say that Israel's regime over the Palestinian people amounts to apartheid, precisely because it displays many of the main features of the crime as defined by international law. Now, number one, racial discrimination against the indigenous Palestinian people who became citizens of the State of Israel was formalised and institutionalised through the creation by law of a Jewish nationality, which is distinct from Israeli citizenship. No Israeli nationality exists, even in Israel, and the Supreme Court has persistently refused to recognise one as it would end the system of Jewish supremacy in Israel. In 1950, the law of Jewish return entitled all Jews and only Jews to the rights of nationals, namely the right to enter Israel and immediately enjoy full and legal political rights. Now, number two, the 1952 Israeli citizenship law has created a discriminatory two-tier legal system whereby Jews hold nationality and citizenship, while the remaining indigenous Palestinian citizens hold only citizenship. Under Israeli law, the status of Jewish nationality is accompanied with first-class rights and benefits which are not granted to Palestinian citizens. Number three, the Israeli status law of 1952 authorises the World Zionist Organization, Jewish Agency and its subsidiaries, including the Jewish National Fund, to control most of the land in Israel for the exclusive benefit of Jews. And this constitutes an institutionalized form of discrimination because these agencies, by definition, would deny the use of these properties to non-Jewish citizens of the state. And number four, the return of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons as required by international law has been prevented by means of force and legislation simply because they are not Jews. Palestinian refugees were denationalized and thus turned into stateless refugees. You see, Israel's occupation has evolved into a system of warehousing, which Israel is attempting to present as a permanent given, a non-issue, a state of status quo, immune to genuine solution. I mean, it's worse than the apartheid era of South Africa. From every point of view, historically, culturally, politically, and economically, the Palestinians have been defined as surplus humanity. Nothing remains to do with these people except warehousing, which the international community appears willing to allow Israel to do. And if Israel can package and export its layered matrix of control, a system of permanent repression that combines Kafkaesque administration law and planning with overtly coercive forms of control over a defined population hemmed in by hostile gated communities, which they call settlements in this case, and also hemmed in by walls and obstacles of various kinds to movement, then as Naomi Klein writes, every country will eventually look like Israel-Palestine. One part looks like Israel and the other part looks like Gaza. In other words, a global Palestine. You see, what you see, folks, is that with this warehousing and surplusing of humanity, Israel is offering a very useful model that can then be applied to surplus populations everywhere. So you can see where they're going with this, folks, and you can see the importance of addressing this, because if we allow this to continue in Palestine, then we are saying, hey, this is a workable method, and what we're going to see is that that method will eventually reach every country on the planet. This is what they do, folks. They try it out somewhere. Oh, look, the people aren't complaining. Okay, this is what we can do. And all you need is a controlled media, and you can convince people within the countries which this warehousing is occurring that it's good to treat these surplus people this way. I mean, just the concept of surplus human beings is a bizarre thing in itself. Now, as far as Palestinians in the West Bank go, what we see here is that Israel has put into place a matrix that has virtually paralysed the Palestinian population. And this matrix is composed of several overlapping layers. First is the actual physical control, settlements, a massive system of highways and bypass roads, army bases and industrial parks at key locations, closed military areas, nature preserves, control of aquifers and internal checkpoints and control of all border crossings. The second layer of the matrix is bureaucratic and legal. It involves political zoning of lands to freeze natural development, building permits enforced by housing demolitions to confine populations to restricted enclaves, land expropriation, planting restrictions and the destruction of Palestinian crops, restrictions on movement, restrictions on travel and more. I mean, there's so much. The third layer involves the use of violence to maintain control over the matrix. There is massive imprisonment and torture. Currently, as I said earlier, there are more than 4,600 political prisoners in various locations and jails throughout Israel. Use of collaborators to control local population is also favoured, and pressure on families to sell their lands, and the undemocratic and arbitrary and violent rule of the military commander of the West Bank and the civil administration. And of course, the average Israeli has no concept of this matrix, whereas average Palestinians are highly attuned to its presence since they hit up against it quite literally every time they attempt to move or do virtually anything. Now, when we talk about Palestinians in East Jerusalem, what we find is that since 1967, around 2,000 homes in East Jerusalem have been demolished. The number of outstanding demolition orders is estimated to be at around 20,000. The absence of a building permit can lead to an administrative or court decision to demolish a home, and whilst Palestinians represent about 30% of Jerusalem's population, they are currently confined to just 7% of the city's area, a so-called policy which is aimed at preserving the demographics of the city. This policy is put into practice via a series of discriminatory measures, discriminatory urban planning, discrimination in the allocation of public services between East and West Jerusalem, passive or active support for Judaization of East Jerusalem through illegal settlement construction, precarious residency status, and the demolition process. Housing demolitions are just one mechanism within a matrix of control implemented by Israel via military, economic, administrative, and cultural occupation. Discrimination against Palestinians in Jerusalem is aimed at delegitimizing their presence and claims over the city. Israel local and national governments systematically deny Palestinian legitimacy and make lives unsustainable, while concurrently colonizing Palestinian neighborhoods. These processes are, of course, aimed at the quiet transfer of Palestinian residents out of East Jerusalem.